Welcome to China in Focus. I'm Tiffany Meyer. Our top story. In his first interview since starting his second term, President Trump downplays concerns that TikTok is spying on young American users. More on what he says about the app's future.
But those that say they know spying app for the Communist Chinese.
We have so many things made in China, so why don't they mention that,
The U.S. handing a 16-month prison term to a Chinese agent who stalked a New Jersey resident. More on how his trial highlights Beijing's transnational repression on U.S. soil. The CEO of JPMorgan Chase does a 180 in talking about Trump's planned tariffs. A closer look at what he says now. And Chief Diplomat Marco Rubio is heading to Panama next week amid concerns about Chinese influence over the Panama Canal. A deep dive into why access to the transportation lane is key to the U.S. military.
A lot of Americans alive today, maybe most of them, just can't imagine the idea of America actually losing a war. But the Panama Canal was an essential part of it.
Welcome to China in Focus. I'm Tiffany Meyer. Before we dive into today's news, make sure to use the link down below to subscribe to our newsletter. Each week, we round up the highlights and controversies happening around China and the world, and share an exclusive behind-the-scenes snapshot with our readers. Keep an eye out. The newsletter will land in your inbox Friday morning. Why single out TikTok for national security concerns if other Chinese exports are largely posing the similar threat? That's the message President Trump floated about TikTok on Wednesday during his first TV interview since taking office. The remark comes just 2 days after signing an executive order to grant the app 75 days to avoid a U.S. ban. Here's President Trump sitting down with Fox's Sean Hannity in front of the Resolute desk.
How about with youth? I won youth by 36 points. Now, maybe that's because I went on TikTok. I don't know. But I'm starting to have a very warm spot.
TikTok is going to be sold, right?
I think TikTok's going to maybe stay around.
People like
I'll tell you, people want to buy it. People want to buy it.
But those that say they know say it's a spying app for the Communist Chinese.
But you can say that about everything made in China. Look, we have our telephones made in China for the most part. We have so many things made in China. So why don't they mention that,
Let me get to
the
some
interesting
issues.
thing with TikTok, though, is you're dealing with a lot of young people. So
they love it.
Is it that important for China to be spying on young people, on young kids watching crazy videos on things?
I don't want China spying on anybody.
No, but they make you telephones and they make you computers and they make a lot of other things. Isn't that a bigger threat?
I'm sure that'll be part of your discussions with President Xi, which I'm going to talk about.
TikTok might be the most popular made-in-China product America has ever seen. Even President Trump said he has no choice but to try to keep it. The short-form video platform has 170 million users in the U.S. That's more than half of the American population. The president himself has 15 million fans on TikTok. Trump raised a proposal that would seek to balance the app's vast popularity with Americans' data security. That is, splitting TikTok's ownership evenly between the U.S. and China. With 50% ownership, the U.S. could better police the app, which could efficiently fix loopholes related to U.S. national security. On Monday, Beijing's foreign ministry signaled for the first time that it is open to a TikTok sale, if that's what the company wants. But if China doesn't go through with it and refuses to sell any of TikTok, Trump threatened he might impose 100% tariffs on Chinese goods. As for who might buy the app, SpaceX and Tesla CEO Elon Musk and Oracle founder Larry Ellison are among the billionaires suggested. Trump said this week he would approve of either one buying TikTok. So exactly what threats does TikTok pose to Americans? Lawmakers have criticized the app as a way for China to harvest American user data. According to China's counter-espionage law, TikTok parent ByteDance must hand over all data to Chinese authorities if they request it, including that from American users. TikTok denies this. TikTok has said the app collects certain keystroke patterns. The U.S. sentencing a Chinese citizen to 16 months in prison Wednesday. That's over stalking a former Chinese official living in New Jersey. Zheng Chongying, along with two others, including a retired NYPD officer, pressured the New Jersey resident to return to China. U.S. officials say it's part of a Chinese program to harass its critics and dissidents abroad. Beijing says the program, dubbed Operation Fox Hunt, targets fugitives. Zheng, along with two others, Michael McMahon and Zhu Yong, pressured New Jersey resident Xu Jing to return to China to face bribery charges there. He denies the accusation, instead saying he was targeted because of the Chinese regime's internal politics. Zheng had left a threatening note at Xu's home. It translates to, quote, "If you are willing to go back to the mainland and spend 10 years in prison, your wife and children will be all right. That's the end of this matter." Zhen's lawyer Paul Goldberger told the court that Zhen later regretted his actions and tried to get the letter back. Prosecutors argued that Zhen returned to check and see if the note had been received. Zhen, a Chinese citizen, was convicted of stalking and conspiracy to stalk, though he was cleared of other charges. He was sentenced this week, while Zhu Yong got a 2-year sentence last week. Michael McMahon, a retired U.S. cop, will be sentenced later this winter. A flip-flop from the CEO of the largest bank in the U.S., JPMorgan Chase CEO, on Wednesday, calling Trump's planned tariffs a valuable economic weapon. It's a marked reversal from 7 years ago, when he repeatedly said Trump's China tariffs were a threat to the economy. Watch.
If it's a little inflationary, but it's good for national security, so be it. I mean, get over it. National security trumps a little bit more inflation, but I think the question is how they get used. Can they be used to bring people to the table? Yes. Is there some unfair trade? Yes. Is there some state-owned subsidies? Yes. Is the president going to use that way in his team? Yeah, and we'll see.
This differs from his warnings back in 2018 that Trump's China tariffs may threaten the U.S. economy. This is a marked change, given Dimon has been a longtime critic of Trump. He backed Kamala Harris during the presidential race. Dimon did not elaborate further on how tariffs would improve national security. Trump announced that starting next Saturday, a 25% tariff will be placed on Mexico and Canada, while China will face a 10% tariff. Secretary of State Marco Rubio is heading to Central America next week. This trip comes as the Trump administration is working to stem illegal immigration and Chinese Communist Party influence in the region. NTD's Washington correspondent Jack Bradley has more from the U.S. State Department.
Secretary of State Marco Rubio will travel to Central America and the Caribbean next week as his first trip abroad as top U.S. diplomat. Now, Rubio is expected to meet with leaders in Panama, Guatemala, El Salvador, and the Dominican Republic. Now, this comes as President Trump has said that he wants the U.S. to take back control of the Panama Canal, one of the world's most critical waterway trade routes. The U.S. government built and operated the canal in the early 20th century, and under President Jimmy Carter, control of this waterway was handed over to the Panamanian government. Trump reiterated during his inauguration speech that Chinese entities related to the Chinese Communist Party are now operating the canal.
We have been treated very badly from this foolish gift that should have never been made, and Panama's promise to us has been broken. The purpose of our deal and the spirit of our treaty has been totally violated. American ships are being severely overcharged and not treated fairly in any way, shape, or form, and that includes the United States Navy. And above all, China is operating the Panama Canal, and we didn't give it to China, we gave it to Panama, and we're taking it back.
Secretary Rubio has repeatedly said and reiterated during his confirmation hearing that the Chinese Communist Party is America's biggest adversary. After that hearing, he received unanimous support from the Senate.
The Communist Party of China leads the PRC, is the most potent and dangerous near-peer adversary this nation has ever confronted. They have elements that the Soviet Union never possessed.
Rubio's trip comes as President Trump has made ending mass illegal immigration to the U.S. as a top priority. Many illegal immigrants in the U.S. pass through the Darien Gap, then Panama, making their way up through the southern border. Now, Rubio is likely to discuss this in meetings in Panama. Last year, the U.S. and Panamanian governments signed an agreement to stem the tide of illegal immigration along the Darien Gap. Reporting from the State Department, Jack Bradley, NTD News.
President Trump's comment about taking back the Panama Canal continues to ripple out. We hear from an expert about why access to the canal is an essential part of U.S. war plans. But first off, Panama's president was asked Wednesday if he's concerned the U.S. would invade. Here's his response. Watch.
Be serious, be serious.
Molino was speaking at the World Economic Forum in Davos. He said the canal belongs to Panama and will remain so.
It's worth noting a treaty between the U.S. and Panama allows the U.S. military to defend the canal when it lost neutrality. At the same time, Panama is investigating a Hong Kong company that controls 2 Panamanian ports at either ends of the canal. Panama's government launched the audit on Monday, right after Trump threatened to take the canal back. The Panama Canal is critical to the U.S. economy. It dramatically cuts the transit time for ships to travel between the Atlantic Ocean and the Pacific Ocean, thereby saving fuel and other costs. China is the canal's second largest customer behind the U.S. What makes access to the Panama Canal critical for the U.S. Navy, and how do China's planned projects there play into Beijing's strategy of surrounding the United States? NTD's Evelyn Lee spoke with Colonel Grant Newsham, a senior fellow at the Center for Security Policy and the author of When China Attacks. Let's dive in.
Also, what's behind the worry that China is exerting increasing control on the Panama Canal? We're bringing in Colonel Grant Newsham. He's a senior fellow at the Center for Security Policy and the author of When China Attacks. Good morning, Colonel Newsham. So tell me more about what Trump is referring to when he says China controls the Panama Canal, and why that is a worry in the first place.
Well, it's a worry because of geography. And you know how the Panama Canal is, how the Americans are able to, for one thing, move their navy from the East Coast to the West Coast and vice versa. It's an absolutely essential sort of artery for us to move our navy, but also to have the commercial shipping, which goes through there as well. If you control that and you can block it off, then as China could, then you have the potential to make it so America cannot really move its fleet from the Pacific, from the Atlantic to the Pacific without maybe going around the southern end of South America. And it's about as strategic a location as there is. The Chinese have had a presence there for well over 20 years now. And as usual, it starts with a commercial presence, which leads to political influence. And there's always a security angle to this. And having the potential, as I said, to block this key artery is priceless for the Chinese. It's just amazing that they've been allowed to get it.
Yeah, and you touched on something like on the commercial influence. China also now practices something called supply chain war. It's basically to punish companies that undermine China's national interest for example, because they're following U.S. restrictions on Chinese entities, just for some context. So they will basically choke access to critical materials, as in China will. So do you see the Panama Canal fitting into this particular strategy for China?
Well, it's part of China's sort of broader strategy of unrestricted warfare, which is to use every lever, every avenue of approach to put pressure on the United States and our allies and our friends so that they can, say, pressure us economically, commercially, and also potentially put us on the back foot militarily as well. The Chinese do look at this as all of these angles, the commercial, the economic, the propaganda, the drug warfare, the fentanyl, as war. And we just refuse to look at it that way, but they have set themselves up throughout the world with a number of ports where they have either ownership or access, airfields as well. They're setting up the infrastructure to one day have the People's Liberation Army operating from these facilities. But for now, it is the influence and really control that they have over Panama that puts them in a position where they can give the American military a huge, huge headache by not being able to freely access and transit the Panama Canal.
So going over to, because you said it starts commercially and goes to political influence, now China is also proposing big projects like a high-speed rail line that China would build in Panama, a new subway line in Panama City, and then a modern container port. And now there is also the port in Chancay, Peru, that was in the news a while ago. So how do you look at all these ties that China is working so hard to build?
Well, they're gradually building the political influence to surround the United States. They do it not just in Latin America, where they are extremely active, but also in Africa, the Middle East, Southeast Asia. And it's really a strategy. In some ways, it's like Mao's guerrilla strategy, where you take the countryside to surround the cities. In this case, it's the United States which is being surrounded. And you do have to look at Chinese commercial activity as part and parcel of their war against the United States, said to surround the U.S., to weaken it. And 20 years ago, the United States was the dominant economic power in Latin America. Now it's China. And that has happened in other places as well. So President Trump and his advisors are right to be very concerned about the situation in Panama, the rest of Latin America as well. But looking at the Panama Canal and trying to come up with some innovative solutions to that is a good thing that Trump and his advisors are doing. And keep in mind that the treaty that the United States has, under which they gave back the Panama Canal to Panama, actually gives the Americans the right to go in and defend the neutrality of the Panama Canal. So if anybody, and especially an enemy like the Chinese, and they're the ones who use the word enemy and call us that, an enemy that gets potential control of the Panama Canal, well, America actually has the legal right to come and do something about it.
Right. So just before we go here, I do want to get this in because let's bring this on a lower level, basically. If we would translate this into, the people at home in the U.S., how would this danger translate to, what is your immediate concern for how this could translate to them?
Well, ultimately, for example, if there's an attack on Taiwan or a serious attack on the Philippines and the Americans need to move forces into the Pacific, we can't do it. We can't do it without great, great trouble. And that means that we just might lose a war. And America hasn't lost one for a long while. We haven't won one for a long while, of course. But we are in a position where we could get a real bloody nose out in the Western Pacific and find that we are no longer a Pacific power and that the most we can do is operate from Hawaii. So I think a lot of Americans alive today, maybe most of them, just can't imagine the idea of America actually losing a war. But the Panama Canal is an essential part of America's war plans or war strategies, and without it, and without being able to use it, we will have a very, very hard time, especially given the way that our military has declined over the last 20, 30 years as well.
Got it. Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate you coming on to Last Minute. Thank you so much, Colonel Grant Newsham.
Sure. Thank you for having me.
Coming up, NATO's chief saying a plan to counter China and Russia in the Arctic is in the works, plus his take on Trump's comments about Greenland.
What he said is we have to make sure that the Arctic is of a huge geopolitical interest and we have to get our act together.
And what's the first order of business for newly sworn-in Secretary of State Marco Rubio? Boosting the U.S. defense presence in the Indo-Pacific to counter Chinese aggression. Secretary Rubio tells the Philippines that the U.S. has its back. That's coming up. Welcome back to China in Focus. I'm Tiffany Meyer. NATO Secretary General Marco Rutte said today he agrees with President Trump that the Arctic is of huge geopolitical importance. Speaking at the World Economic Forum, Rutte said NATO needs a holistic strategy to fend off Russia and China.
No, he didn't say that he is going to invade Greenland. Nobody said that. What he said is we have to make sure that the Arctic is of a huge geopolitical interest and we have to get our act together. And clearly he's right here, and I know that he has on this the support of Mette Frederiksen and others. What I'm seeing now is that Finland, Norway, others, because Finland is a big supplier of icebreakers, all of these countries, including the US, are discussing and dialoguing how to make sure that we have a holistic strategy on the Arctic and that we fend off the Russians and the Chinese.
Rutte also said Ukraine needs more weapons to help them negotiate with President Putin from a position of strength. The Secretary General said member states must increase their spending on defense.
Rutte urged the U.S. to keep supplying Ukraine with weapons to fight Russia, adding he's sure Europeans would foot the bill. Newly confirmed, Secretary of State Marco Rubio's first order of business, affairs in the Indo-Pacific. He spoke on the phone with his Filipino counterparts on Wednesday, stressing the U.S.'s defense commitment to its longtime ally in the South China Sea, the Philippines. He also condemned China's, quote, dangerous and destabilizing actions in the region. The call follows the Philippines' rising concerns over Chinese aggression. Earlier this week, the Philippines arrested 3 Chinese nationals, accusing them for collecting intelligence of the country's military installations. Zooming out, Chinese Coast Guard troops have clashed with Filipino boats multiple times in recent years, even inside Manila's exclusive economic zone. China claims almost the entire South China Sea as Chinese territory, including areas claimed by neighboring nations. Beijing has ongoing South China Sea disputes with Southeastern Asian nations, including the Philippines, Indonesia, and Vietnam. A 2016 international ruling invalidated Beijing's territory claims. China rejects the ruling. Back to Rubio's phone call. The State Department said the secretary criticized China for undermining regional peace and stability in the South China Sea. One day before the call, Rubio hosted a meeting with top diplomats from Australia, India, and Japan. The forum, also known as the Quad, is designed to counter military and economic threats from China. That's all for today's China in Focus. I'm Tiffany Meyer. If you have any feedback on the show or have something you'd like to see us cover, send us an email at chinainfocus@ntd.com. We'd love to hear from you. For round-the-clock original news coverage, visit us at ntd.com or download our NTD app. Thanks for watching. See you tomorrow.